World War I was the last time the horse would be used on a massive scale in modern conflict. And used they were. Over 1 million horses were sent to the Western Front by Britain, and over 900,000 did not make it back home. These numbers mirror the human losses at the battles of the Somme and Passchendaele. Jack Seeley was a close friend to Winston Churchill. He was a politician and a distinguished general serving the British Army in the First World War. There is no account so vivid of what horses had to endure in World War I as that of Jack Seeley. But what I'd like to focus on today is how he depicted the journey with his horse Warrior and how well he depicts the journey that millions of these horses endured during the war. Horses were just as much a target for the enemy as were men. One of the worst things to be done to horses is the dropping of caltrops, a torture-looking device that would split the horse's hoof and ensure a certain but painful death. A weapon that would be dropped in the mud and was hard to see, but even outside of the front, they were a target. One of our troubles was that the famous airman Richthofen, perhaps the bravest of either side of that most gallant band of flying men, well nigh established a local air supremacy for Germany. His observers would spot these convoys of horses and direct their artillery fire on them, often with great effect. They would even swoop down and attack them with their machine guns. Of course, our men were doing just the same thing to the Germans on the other side of the line. On one occasion, when Warrior was struck fast, a German flew down and emptied his machine gun belt on us. The bullets were very near, but none of them hit us. He talked about horses and enemies with great respect, and I think that's something that we could learn from in this day and age. It was a wonderful battle. I did not know that men could be so self-sacrificing and so brave. They all knew that if they failed and the Channel ports were captured, it was all over with the Allied cause, and perhaps with England too. So they fought for weeks on end, in blood and mud, and misery with a spirit never equaled in the history of the British Army. I love to know that my warrior bore his humble part in that August event. I love the quote from Yitzhak Rabin: "You don't make peace with your friends, you make them with your unsavory enemies." And Jack Seeley ran into his enemy, Prince Rupert of Bavaria, which was opposed to him at the Flowerdew Charge later in life, and even then he spoke about him with respect. Some years afterwards I saw Prince Rupert of Bavaria, who was commanding the army opposed to us. From him I learned he was also on a Gravour spur that morning. From the map he showed, I estimated that warrior cannot have been within more than 600 yards of that redoubtable army commander. Someday I hope he will come here and renew acquaintance with my old horse. So, what makes a good war horse, or as talked about by General Seeley, a charger? Seemingly the same thing as what makes a good soldier: controlled fear and determination. While being shelled and fired at every occasion becomes the daily matter, there is no time to falter. For a brief moment I was completely happy, but of course it could not last. We rode into a small village where some of our men were posted, and so to the little chateau where the mayor lived. As I talked to him and gave him certain information, we heard the crashing roar of shells. The stables of the chateau were hit and immediately burst into flames. It was the first time that I had ridden Warrior under shell fire. To my amazement, Warrior made no attempt to run away. I could feel him tremble a bit between my legs as we trotted through the gate. He was trying to be brave and succeeded in his task. Seeley bred Warrior on the Isle of Wight after purchasing his mother, a thoroughbred, in South Africa where he was stationed. It was very common for soldiers to bring along their own horses since the British had promised to throw everything they got into this war endeavor. By great good fortune, we crossed into the same boat and walked ashore together. I thought that we were in for a long war, but I did not think that we would be in that country together for more than 4 years. Nor did I dare to hope that if this should be our fate, we should both return alive. Out of the 1 million horses the British brought over to the Western Front, 900,000 did not make it back. And reading about the numerous accounts on which the warrior barely escapes death, this does not come as a surprise. At the end of the war, Warrior was dubbed the horse that the Germans could not kill. Warrior was with a bunch of horses of which a big shell fell. He was one of a few survivors. I was sent down into the village and ran forward with a sergeant and 8 men of the Lancaster Regiment. Our party was caught by accurate machine gun fire, and every one of the party was laid stone dead, except for myself. Warrior was about 300 yards from me when this happened. Warrior and the general faced heavy artillery on a daily basis for 4 years long, but next to them were countless soldiers and horses that were not so lucky to ever come back home. A strange thing had happened. One of the German shells, instead of bursting into small fragments when it struck the ground, had broken in half as they sometimes did. One half of the shell had struck my brigade mayor's horse straight into the chest and cut it clean in half. The orderly was knocked down by the force of the blow and must have been unconscious for a little time. He was still sitting on the ground when we returned, and there was Warrior, who had just moved away a few yards and was waiting for me. He neighed loudly as I came in sight and cantered up to me, saying quite clearly, "I would not leave you." I was asleep one morning when my aide-de-camp woke me with a shout saying the house has been on fire and had already been hit 6 times. I jumped up in my pajamas and bare feet and ran across the yard to Warrior's stable. I would not dare to recount this episode, but that there were many eyewitnesses living who will confirm it. I could hear Warrior beating against the door with his forefeet. I threw it open and out he bounded. I ran after him to catch his headstall, and before I had gone 2 yards, a shell burst right into his stable and knocked the whole place into smithereens. It was a miraculously lucky escape. One day, he was lame, and I rode another horse, a chestnut. A chance shell hit him and killed him. I had 3 broken ribs myself, and I did not know it, but my first thought was, what a luck it was not Warrior. When it was nearly complete, a bullet struck poor Saint-Quentin in the neck, and he fell stone dead. I don't know why I chose Saint-Quentin instead of Warrior that day, but so it happened. While most soldiers died as a result of artillery and trench warfare, most horses died of exhaustion or artillery fire. Horses were essential not only for charges, but also to bring ammunition from one place to the next part on the front. The somber close for the Battle of the Somme was cruel to horses no less than to men. The roads were so completely broken up by the alternate frost, snow and rain that the only way to get ammunition to the forward batteries was to carry it up in panniers slung on horses. Often these poor beasts, who were led forward in long strings with 3 shells on each side of them, would sink deep into the mud. Sometimes, in spite of all their struggles, they could not extricate themselves and died where they fell. Many times I accompanied these melancholy convoys with Warrior. During the winter of 1917, Warrior had some very hard times. Exhausting times. Cruel times. The march to the Battle of Passchendaele was one of them. There were many dead horses lying about, which has foundered in the mud and could not be extricated. All of a sudden, Warrior went deep into the mud up into his belly. Another one of those narrow escapes that Warrior endured. Not knowing it themselves, but soon they were closing in on Warrior's finest moment yet. Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew was an Englishman that emigrated to Saskatchewan, Canada in 1903. Quickly rising to the ranks, as it would later prove, he too was a man of exceptional courage. There are thousands of guns and they're all roaring at the same time. The Germans are getting what have been giving our men since the war began. Last night, while we were having supper, a shell burst about a quarter of a mile away. I don't know if it was from a gun or a drop from an airplane. Gordon Flowerdew died as a result of the Flowerdew Charge. There I received the news that I was to command all the available Canadian cavalry, to be formed into a mounted brigade. There thousands of men and horses, comprising cavalry, artillery, engineers, signalers, and Army Service Corps. A wonderful command for any man to be privileged to lead, and such men. A single shot rang out, fired from the rushes quite near to us, and MacDonald's horse fell dead. His horse's nose and Warrior were almost touching, with a very desperate hand-to-hand fighting ensued. The horsemen engaged the grenadiers, and first with their pistols, and then, when these were discharged, taken up their swords and falling upon the Saxons. Cutting and thrusting, the infantry offered a stubborn opposition, and for some moments the battle raged on and fro, and in and out of the woods, among fallen men and horses. Not one of them allowed himself to be taken prisoner. Each man had kept the last round in the pistol for themselves. Such was the spirit of the men who took part in this desperate action. It was a wonderful day. The main attack swept up and the woods were soon filled with galloping Canadian horsemen. Both sides, ours and the Germans, seemed to be filled with some extraordinary exultation. Neither would surrender. Again and again these brave Bavarians and Saxons too and men from every part of Germany, surrounded and wounded, would continue to fire. But on either side, not one man holds up his hands and surrendered. One determined Bavarian, with his sword thrust right through his neck, raised his rifle just level with Warrior's near shoulder and had a last shot before he died. Soon after this last charge, the end of the war came in sight, and that was the last possibility for another charge, ending a 5,000-year-old tradition of men and horses in war. Warrior is a symbol for all those war horses that were used in war and showed bravery next to their soldier companions. After the war, Warrior returned to the Isle of Wight, where he spent the latter of his days in peace, dying of the old age of 33, safe in his home in 1941.